All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going on a journey to see how thinkers in the Islamic intellectual tradition acted as philosophers.
We're going to be looking at some really fascinating theological and philosophical texts.
Yeah, and it's like we're going to try to extract some of those really juicy insights.
Exactly. And see how these thinkers really grappled with some fundamental questions about existence, belief, the whole deal.
Big questions.
The big questions. And it's
Yeah.
it's really cool to see how these debates have continued to resonate even today, centuries later.
Yeah. All right, so one of the first big ones, and this is something that pretty much every tradition has had to grapple with, is that relationship between faith and reason.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
That's a classic. And it's not a simple thing either, right? Like when we say reason, are we talking about just basic thinking or are we talking about full-blown philosophical inquiry?
yeah,
And then faith, I mean, that could be just a general sense of trust or it could be tied to a very specific religious tradition.
right.
So already you can see how this gets really nuanced.
Yeah, for sure. So looking at the sources you provided, it seems like there were like three main camps when it came to figuring out how much we can actually know about religious matters just by using our own noggins.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So, camp number one, they were all about the power of reason. They basically thought, look, we can figure out God, morality, the whole nine yards just by thinking things through.
Really? No need for like any divine guidance or anything?
Nope. They thought reason was enough. And, one example who sometimes gets lumped into this group is Abu Bakr al-Razi.
Okay. What did he think?
Well, he even suggested that scripture, holy books, could be unnecessary or even misleading. So he was pretty hardcore about the whole reason thing.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement. So then what about like the opposite end of the spectrum?
Okay, so the opposite view was essentially that reason has its limits, especially when you're dealing with the really big questions about God and all that. They believed that you absolutely needed revelation, direct communication from the divine to truly understand these matters.
So basically, don't even try to figure it out on your own. You need that divine download.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so then that leaves like the middle ground.
Right. And, as often happens, that middle ground is where things get really
I
interesting.
was going to say, the middle ground always has the most nuance, right?
Yeah, totally. So this group, they said that reason could get you started, maybe to the point of understanding that there's some kind of higher power out there.
Like, okay, there's something bigger than us, but what exactly is it?
Exactly. But then, for the specifics, the details about doctrine and all that, they said you needed revelation. And a lot of the big name philosophers actually fell into this camp.
Okay, so Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Tafil, Ibn Rushd, all those guys.
Yep, those guys. And a lot of them made a distinction between those who could really get into the philosophical weeds and those who, maybe needed things explained a little more simply.
Right. Like, maybe for some people, the complex philosophical proofs are enough, but for others, the symbolism and stories in religious texts make it a lot easier to understand.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not like they were saying everyone needs to be a philosopher, but they recognized that different people had different ways of approaching these big questions.
That makes sense. So then, how did these philosophers, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and the rest, how did they actually understand this whole interplay between faith and reason?
Okay, well, Al-Farabi, he was kind of a trailblazer here. His big idea was that people have different intellectual capacities, right? So naturally, they're going to have different ways of being persuaded by truths, including religious truths.
Okay, so not everyone's on the same intellectual level. Some people need more, I don't know, hand-holding or scaffolding.
Exactly. And he divided people into three groups based on this. First, you got the super brainiacs, the philosophers. They're the ones who are convinced by these really airtight logical arguments, what he called demonstrative proofs.
They're the ones who are all about that pure, unadulterated reason.
Right. Then you got the second group. They're a little more persuaded by probable arguments, things that are based on accepted premises, but maybe aren't quite as rock solid. And for them, scripture plays a bigger role. It helps to kind of back things up.
Okay, so they need a little more support. And then the third group.
The third group, they're the ones who are moved more by imagery, stories, the emotional stuff. And Al-Farabi saw religious scripture as being super important for them because it presents these truths in a way that speaks to their heart.
Right, so it's all about tailoring the message to the audience. It's
Yeah.
almost like, different learning styles or something.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So essentially, Al-Farabi was saying, look, Reason can get us to the truth, but the way we get there, the way we understand it, that's going to be different for everyone. And religious authority, he saw that as playing a really important role in making sure everyone could access these truths in a way that made sense to them.
That makes a lot of sense. So Al-Farabi sets the stage, and then how do the other philosophers build on this?
Well, Ibn Tufayl, he has this really cool philosophical novel, Hey Ibn Yaksan. It's about this guy who grows up on a deserted island, completely isolated, and he manages to figure out all these crazy truths about the world and even God just by using his own reason. But then he eventually meets some people from a religious community.
Oh, that's got to be interesting. So what happens?
Well, he realizes that not everyone is like built to go on this intense solo intellectual journey. Some people need that community, that shared tradition. It's not that they're less intelligent, it's just a different way of approaching things. And then Ibn Rushd, he actually straight up endorsed Al-Farabi's three-tiered view in his own legal writings. So it seems like this idea really resonated with a lot of these thinkers.
Yeah, it's really practical, isn't it? It acknowledges that we can't just expect everyone to be a philosopher, and that's okay.
Exactly.
So we've got the philosophers, they're all about the power of reason, but they also recognize the importance of revelation. Now, what about the theologians? How did they approach this question of, like, who can know what without a direct religious message?
Well, they often framed it in terms of like responsibility.
Yeah.
If someone's never even heard of Islam, are they still accountable to God? And thinkers like Al-Qadi Abdel Jabbar and Abu Mansur Maturidi, they said yes. They believed that everyone, assuming they're of sound mind and all that, they have this basic responsibility to believe in some fundamental truths.
What kind of truths?
Things like God's existence, the idea of justice, the concept of messengers from God, an afterlife, and the importance of ethical conduct. They thought these were things that everyone could figure out just by using their reason, like it was part of our natural makeup as humans.
That was like a universal moral compass?
Yeah, something like that. And later, the Maturity and Ash'ari schools, they took this even further. They said that reason could actually help you verify if a prophet was legit.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just blind faith. You can actually use your reason to figure out if you should trust a prophet.
Exactly. They believed that you could look at the evidence, consider the prophet's character, and make a rational judgment. So even accepting revelation itself, they thought there was a role for reason there.
Okay, so we've talked about how much reason can tell us about, like, general religious ideas. Now, what about specific beliefs, like the actual tenets of a religion?
Right. Well, that brings us to the idea of evidentialism. And this was a big deal for the philosophers and the Mutazilite theologians. They basically believed that you need good reasons, like solid logical arguments, to justify your beliefs, even religious ones.
So it's not enough to just say, I believe this because, it's what I was taught.
Right. You need to be able to back it up. And for the philosophers, the gold standard was demonstrative proof, like the kind of arguments that leave no room for doubt. But they also recognized that not everyone could reach that level of certainty.
Yeah, not everyone can be a philosopher. So what about the rest of us?
Well, they thought that as long as your beliefs were based on, some kind of reasonable evidence or interpretation of scripture, then you were good,
Yeah.
especially if your religion aligned with philosophical truths.
So like a hierarchy of justification.
Yeah, something like that. And the Mutazilites, they took this whole evidentialism thing and really ran with it.
Yeah.
Well, they thought that once you've established God's existence and attributes through reason, then it makes sense that God would want to guide humanity, right? So you can actually use reason to figure out that prophecy is likely to exist.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're not just taking prophecy on faith, you're using reason to anticipate it.
Exactly. And then once you have a potential prophet, you can evaluate them, look at their miracles, see if their message is consistent, and so on. And if they pass the test, then you have a rational basis for accepting their message.
So it's like a two-step process. First, you use reason to figure out that prophecy is likely, and then you use reason to evaluate the specific prophet.
Exactly. But not everyone was on board with this whole reason-first approach. There were plenty of thinkers who felt like reason had its limits, especially when it came to religious matters.
Right, because if you take that evidentialist view too far, it's like you're saying, well, if you can't prove it with logic, then you can't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't really leave much room for faith, does it?
Exactly. And the Ash'arites, the Maturidites, and a lot of the more traditional scholars, they really push back against this.
Like Ibn Hanbal, for example.
Yeah, Ibn Hanbal is a good example. They essentially argued that this whole demand for rational justification, it just assumed too much about human reason. Like, it assumed that we were capable of understanding these deep, mysterious truths about God just by thinking about them.
But isn't that a bit of a cop-out? I mean, if you're not going to provide any rational justification, it's like you're just saying, well, I believe it because I believe it.
Well, they didn't see it that way. They thought that human reason had its limits and that sometimes you just had to trust in revelation. Some of them even proposed alternative frameworks for justification. For example, Al-Juwayni, he had this idea that maybe you couldn't prove every single religious belief individually, but you could look at the whole system of beliefs and see if it was internally consistent.
Okay, so it's like judging a belief based on how well it fits with everything else you believe.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So it's not just about having a logical proof for every single thing. It's about the overall coherence of your worldview.
Interesting. So we've got these different approaches to faith and reason. Now let's get into another area where they really come head to head,
Yeah.
interpreting religious texts.
Ah, yes, Tawil, the art of interpretation.
Right. Because even if you believe in a holy book, there's still the question of how you're supposed to understand it.
Exactly. Like, do you take everything literally, or is there room for metaphor and allegory?
Big question. So what did our Islamic thinkers have to say about this?
Well, we see a whole range of opinions here. Like Al-Farabi, remember how he said that different people need different ways of understanding truth? Well, he kind of took that idea and applied it to scripture. He believed that religious teachings were often symbolic expressions of deeper philosophical truths.
Okay, so like the stories and imagery in scripture, they're not meant to be taken literally. They're pointing to something deeper.
Right. And he even suggested that sometimes these stories might be like noble lies, told to guide people who weren't capable of grasping the full philosophical picture.
Interesting. So it's like a way of making these complex truths more accessible.
Exactly. But of course, not everyone agreed with this. You had folks like Ibn Hanbal who were all about literalism.
No metaphors allowed.
Not really. They believed that the Quran and the Prophet's sayings were clear and complete, so you should just take them at face value. Even the parts that seem kind of anthropomorphic, like where God is described as having hands or a face.
But how can you reconcile that with the idea that God is transcendent beyond our human comprehension?
Well, that was the debate, right? And a lot of thinkers fell somewhere in between these two extremes.
Like who?
Well, Al-Ghazali, for example. He was an Asharite theologian, but he was also really into philosophy.
So he was trying to bridge the gap.
Yeah, kind of. He said that metaphorical interpretation was definitely okay, especially for scholars.
Okay, so not just blindly taking everything literally.
Right. Because he thought that some literal interpretations just didn't make sense, especially when you consider what we can know about God through reason. Like, God can't literally have a body. Right.
Right.
So he said those kinds of verses should be understood metaphorically. And he extended this to anything that the intellect judges impossible. So it's like he was saying, use your brain, people.
I like that.
And Ibn Rushd actually had a similar view, even though he and Al-Ghazali disagreed on a lot of other things. He said that if a religious text seemed to contradict something that had been proven philosophically, then you should interpret the text metaphorically. But he also said that these fancy interpretations should be kept among the intellectuals, don't go confusing the general public.
Smart move.
He also pointed out that there was no real consensus among scholars about which parts of scripture should be taken literally and which parts metaphorically. So it's not like there was one right answer.
Always more to debate.
Always. And then you have someone like Ibn Arabi, the Sufi mystic and philosopher.
Oh, yeah, he was a big one.
He had this really cool idea that every verse of the Quran actually had an infinite number of meanings.
Infinite.
Yeah. So for him, scripture was this endlessly rich source of wisdom, and you could keep digging and digging and never reach the bottom.
Wow, so it's like this ever-unfolding tapestry of meaning.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it.
Okay, so we've talked about faith and reason, interpreting scripture. What happens when religious teachings bump up against science or philosophy? Like, what if you have a scientific discovery or a philosophical proof that seems to contradict something in your holy book?
Oh, yeah, that gets tricky. And the concept of burhan, or demonstration, is really important here.
Demonstration.
Yeah, it's basically like in a way, yeah. Because they believed that truth couldn't contradict itself. So if you had a demonstrated philosophical truth that clashed with a religious teaching, then the religious teaching had to be interpreted in a way that made it compatible.
Okay, I see. So it's not about rejecting scripture. It's about finding a way to understand it that doesn't create contradictions.
Exactly. But the theologians, they weren't just going to roll over and let the philosophers have the last word.
Of course not.
Guys like Al-Ghazali, Shahrastani, and Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, they really scrutinized the philosopher's methods. And they argued that even by the philosopher's own standards, a lot of their so-called demonstrations weren't actually that solid.
Oh, so they were challenging the validity of those philosophical proofs.
Exactly. And Al-Ghazali, he's famous for this book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
Right, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's basically a point-by-point takedown of 20 philosophical theses that were popular among the philosophers.
Wow.
Yeah, he went all out. And his main strategy was to question the starting point of the philosophers' arguments.
Like their assumptions.
Exactly. He said that either those assumptions weren't actually self-evident, or the philosophers hadn't actually proven that they were necessary truths. And it's interesting because on some issues, Al-Ghazali actually agreed with the philosophers' conclusions, but he didn't think they had actually proven those conclusions definitively.
So it was more about the method than the outcome.
Yeah, in part, he was worried that people would just accept these philosophical arguments without really understanding them, and that could lead them astray.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you're not careful, philosophy can be a bit of a slippery slope.
Definitely. But Al-Ghazali, he actually thought that defending Islam with rational arguments was a good thing, as long as it was done by people who were properly trained, intellectually and religiously.
Yeah.
He just didn't think everyone should be trying to do philosophy.
Yeah, it's probably best to leave it to the experts.
Probably.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here with faith and reason. Let's move on to another biggie. Proofs for the existence of God.
All right, let's dive into that. So within Islam, the existence of God was like a given. But a lot of Muslim thinkers, they also put on their philosopher hats and tried to come up with rational arguments to support this belief.
So it's not just about faith, it's about using reason to understand why this belief is justified.
Exactly. And one of the most famous arguments is the argument from temporal coming to be, also known as the Kalam cosmological argument.
Okay, break that down for me.
Okay, so basically it starts with the idea that everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Right.
Like you don't just get something from nothing.
Makes sense.
And then it says that the universe itself began to exist.
Okay, so the universe isn't eternal. It had a starting point.
Right. And if it had a starting point, then it must have had a cause.
And that cause is God.
Bingo! It's all about causality.
So where's the debate? It seems pretty straightforward.
Well, the philosophers, some of them weren't too keen on the idea that the universe had a beginning. They liked the idea of an eternal universe, like Aristotle thought.
So no Big Bang.
Not for them. Guys like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd, they were all about the eternal universe.
Okay, so how did the theologians respond to that?
Well, some of them just flat out said that the whole idea of an actual infinity was just like nonsensical. Like our brains can't even handle that concept.
Yeah, infinity does tend to make my head spin a bit.
Right. But others, they went a bit deeper. They actually tried to show that the idea of an infinite past leads to contradictions.
Okay, like what?
One example they used was the celestial bodies, like the sun and the moon. They said, look, if the universe has always existed, then the sun and the moon have both been orbiting forever.
Right.
But the moon orbits faster than the sun, so that means the moon has completed like 12 times infinity orbits, which just doesn't make sense.
Whoa, yeah, that does sound kind of paradoxical.
Right, so they use that to argue against the idea of an infinite past.
Okay, clever, but I'm sure the philosophers had a comeback, right?
Oh yeah, they always have a comeback. They said that the infinity we're talking about here isn't an actual infinity, it's a potential infinity. Like, there's no end to the past, but it's not like there's a completed set of, like, infinite past events that we can count up.
Okay, so it's more like the past is always extending backwards, but there's no actual end point.
Yeah, something like that.
But the theologians didn't give up, did they?
Nope, they were persistent. They came up with another argument, and this one involved souls.
Souls.
Yeah, so the philosophers, they generally believed that individual souls were immortal.
Okay.
And they also tended to believe that the human species has always existed. So the theologians said, well, if the world and humanity have always existed and souls are immortal, then wouldn't that mean there's an infinite number of souls existing right now?
Oh, I see. Because all those souls from the infinite past would still be around.
Exactly. And they argued that this wasn't just a potential infinity, it was an actual completed infinity, which they thought was just like philosophically impossible.
So it became a battle of the infinities.
Yeah, pretty much. And this debate about the nature of infinity and its implications, it went on for centuries.
That's philosophy for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's move on to another proof. What about the argument from necessity and possibility.
Ah, yes, this one is a classic. It's most famously associated with Ibn Sina, and he lays it out in his book Burhan al-Siddiqin.
Which means the proof of the truthful.
That's right. And what's cool about this argument is that it doesn't actually rely on rejecting the idea of an infinite past.
Really? So it's different from the Kalam argument.
Yeah, totally different approach.
All right.
This one focuses on the nature of existence itself. Ibn Sina starts by making this distinction between a necessary existent and a possible existent.
Okay, so a necessary existent is something that, like, has to exist, it can't not exist.
Yeah.
And a possible existent is something that could exist or could not exist.
Exactly. And he says that we see all these possible existence around us, like trees, rocks, humans, all that stuff.
Right.
But then he asks, okay, is there also such a thing as a necessary existent, something that doesn't depend on anything else for its existence?
Big question. And what's his answer?
He argues that there has to be a necessary existent, and here's how he gets there. He says that a necessary existent must be absolutely simple.
Simple.
Yeah, like it can't be made up of parts, because if it was made up of parts, then its existence would depend on the existence of those parts,
Oh,
right?
yeah, that makes sense.
So a necessary existent has to be one unified thing. And then he says, let's consider anything that exists right now.
Anything at all?
Yeah, anything. A rock, a cloud, whatever. And he says that this thing has to be either a necessary existent or a possible existent. If it's necessary, then boom, we've found God. But if it's possible, then we have to keep going.
Okay, following.
So if it's possible, then he says, okay, let's consider the totality of all possible existence that currently exists, like everything in the universe, all lumped together. And he says that this totality itself also has to be either necessary or possible. It can't be necessary because it's made up of all these individual things that are possible. And remember, a necessary existent has to be simple, not made up of parts. So that means this whole collection of possible things is itself possible, which means it must have a cause.
Okay, so we're pushing that cause further and further back.
Exactly. And then he goes on to argue that this ultimate cause can't be another possible existent, because if it was, then you would either have a circular chain of causes, or you'd have an infinite chain of causes that never actually gets you to a necessary being. So he concludes that this ultimate cause has to be the necessary existent, which he identifies with God.
Wow, that's a pretty dense argument.
Yeah, it's definitely not light reading,
Hmm.
but it's super influential in Islamic philosophy. And what's cool is that it doesn't even depend on the universe having a beginning in time. It's purely about the logic of existence itself.
Okay, so Ibn Sina brings the logic. What about other approaches?
Well, Mullah Sadra, he came along later, and he had this very different, more experiential argument.
Experiential.
Yeah, it's based on the idea of ilm huduri, which basically means knowledge by presence.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So Sadra, he was all about the direct experience of God. He was actually kind of skeptical of those earlier proofs, the ones that started with the world and tried to work their way back to God.
Interesting. So he's flipping the script.
Yeah, in a way, he thought that God was the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, and that we are able to experience God directly all the time, we just might not realize it.
So God's not some distant being that we have to, like, intellectually deduce.
Not for Sadra. He thought God was like right here, right now, the very source of our awareness.
Okay, so then what's his proof?
Well, he didn't really see it as a proof in the traditional sense. It was more like a pointing, a way of directing our attention to this immediate experience of existence.
Okay, I like that. Like a, hey, look over there.
Exactly. And he draws on this Quranic verse that says, God is witness that there is no God but he.
Okay.
And his interpretation of this verse is that we all have this fundamental, undeniable awareness of existence. Like, even when we try to think about nothingness, we're still presupposing that something exists to be nothing, you know?
Yeah, that's trippy.
It is. And Sadra says that this existence that we experience so directly, that's God. He says existence can never be truly negated. It's the most fundamental reality there is. And God is that ultimate, unbounded existence, the source of everything else.
So it's not about proving God's existence through logic. It's about recognizing this immediate experience of existence as divine.
Exactly. He says that recognizing it as God might take some, like, spiritual and intellectual work, but the experience itself is always there. It's undeniable.
Okay, so we've got these different philosophical perspectives on God's existence. What about God's relationship with the universe? Like, how did they understand creation and, God's ongoing role in the world?
Right. So there was pretty broad agreement that God is the creator and that the universe depends on God for its existence. But the specifics of how that all works, that's where things get
I
interesting.
was going to say there's always more to unpack.
Always. So when it came to creation, there were three main models that emerged. We've got emanation, origination, and manifestation.
Okay, three different ways of understanding how God created the universe. Let's take them one by one. What's emanation all about?
Emanation is the idea that the universe kind of flows out of God's being, like it's an overflow of God's own essence. And this flow, it's often seen as eternal and necessary.
Okay, so it's not like God created the universe as a specific point in time. It's more like the universe is internally emanating from God.
Yeah, that's the idea. And Ibn Sina, he was a big fan of this model. He argued that God's act of conserving the universe, like keeping it in existence, implies that creation is an ongoing process, not just a one-time event.
So God's not just the initial creator, God's also constantly sustaining the universe.
Exactly. And he even said that the universe is, at the very least, sempiternal, meaning it has no beginning in time.
Okay, so how did he justify that?
Well, he had this whole thing about God's knowledge.
Oh,
He said that God's self-knowledge is primary and absolute, and because God knows himself as the source of all existence, this knowledge necessarily results in the emanation of the universe.
so it's like God's knowledge is so perfect that it brings the universe into being.
Yeah, something like that. And because God is eternal and unchanging, this emanation is also eternal and unchanging. He also argued against the idea of a temporal creation because he thought it would imply a change in God's will, which would contradict God's simplicity and perfection.
Okay, so for Ibn Sina, creation is this continuous, necessary outflow of being from God.
Exactly. And he saw it as a free act of God's will, but not a deliberative act. It's not like God was choosing between different options. It's just a natural consequence of God's own being.
Okay, so that's emanation. What about origination?
Origination is the view that's favored by the theologians, especially the Asherites. And they weren't too happy with emanation.
Why not?
Well, they thought it made God seem too passive, like God wasn't really choosing to create, it was just this automatic process.
So they wanted to emphasize God's free will.
Exactly. And they also thought that the idea of an eternal creation kind of diminished God's power because it implied that God was somehow dependent on the universe.
Okay, so they wanted to make sure that God was firmly in control.
Yeah, that was a big deal for them.
Yeah.
And they also had this problem with the idea of a change in God's will.
Right, because if God eternally willed the creation, then it's like, well, why didn't God create the universe earlier?
Exactly. That was a tough one for them. So Al-Ghazali, he came up with this interesting solution.
Mr. Incoherence himself.
He said that God eternally willed the creation of the world at the specific moment it came into being.
So God always planned for the universe to be created at that exact time.
Yep. So there's no change in God's will. It's just that God's will always included a specific moment for creation.
But then what determined that moment? Why that specific time and not another?
Good question. And Al-Ghazali's answer is basically that the will, by its very nature, is the ability to choose without any external determining factor.
Okay, so it's a pure act of choice,
Yeah.
not based on any prior reason or cause.
Exactly. And he uses this analogy of a starving person who has two identical pieces of food. There's no reason to choose one over the other, but the person still has to choose, right?
Yeah.
So he says it's the same with God's will. God chooses to create the universe at a specific moment, and that choice is ultimately free and uncaused.
Okay, so it's a free choice, but it's also a choice that God made eternally.
Right. It's kind.